There's a man in Shinjuku who knows more about vintage British leather jackets than most people in the greatest of Britain do. His name is Satoshi Ishijima. His shop is Addict Clothes, and this is the story of that man who became the de facto custodian of a culture thousands of miles from his own. To understand the path that laid before Ishijima-san, we have to start in Britain, in the UK. Lewis Leathers, established in London in 1892, is the oldest British motorcycle clothing company in existence. Belstaff had been producing jackets since 1924. These are institutions with over a century of combined heritage between them. Lewis Leathers' iconic Bronx and Lightning jackets were worn by the ton-up boys and rockers of the 1960s. It became synonymous with the 59 Club and sponsored some of the most storied names in British motorcycle racing. And yet, by the early 2000s, both had drifted, repositioned, rebranded, and in Belstaff's case, they eventually relaunched under Italian ownership with production to match. And quite often when this process happens, a lot of the material and catalog knowledge is diluted, unless someone else picks it up. And that's where we begin our journey, in the early 2000s. Japanese fashion was still deep in that gravitational pull of Ametora, the obsessive, painstaking archiving of American traditional. Vintage Levi's, selvage denim, the workwear revival, and through the emergence of homegrown streetwear brands like Neighborhood and A Bathing Ape, a new reinterpretation of Americana was beginning to take over the cultural conversation. So once again, America became the reference. It was a dominant wave, and like most dominant waves, it left a blind spot. While the market was looking west across the Pacific, the post-war British leather tradition was sitting largely uncontested. Catalogs were corrupted, models were mislabeled, and the heritage being sold back to the enthusiasts was in many cases a copy of a copy, confidently dated wrong. And almost no one noticed, except Satoshi Ishijima.
アメリカのものの方が日本は今よりももっとアメリカ一強だったし、イギリスのものってそれこそバーバーもそうだしベルスタッフもそうだけどほとんどの人は価値を見出してなかったからそれこそこう探したらあったんですよ安くまだ。
An avid motorcyclist since 18, Satoshi developed an attachment to vintage British leather jackets and the culture behind it. To him, a vintage Belstaff was in the same category as a piece from Raf Simons or Margiela, except his interest was in a garment that happened to carry the atmosphere of an entire era. His love was not merely about the purity of the culture, it was about the preservation of it. So he started collecting. Through those early 2000s, Satoshi accumulated over 200 vintage British leather jackets packed in a Tentsubo shop in Toyama, a space barely large enough to contain what he was building. And what he was building in reality was a primary source database. Physical garments cross-referenced against original catalogs spanning the 1930s through the 1980s.
例えばジャケットの名前がこれがファントムだとしたらそれをモンツァって書いてあったりとか70年代のジャケットを50年代って書いてあったりとか僕は当時カタログをいっぱい持ってたからその当時のカタログを名前も年代も全部わかるわけですよね。
Which created a problem. He could source and sell original vintage as he had been doing, but he couldn't find anything new that held up against the historical truth sitting in his own archive. And customers kept asking him to part with the pieces he was personally wearing, the ones he loved the most and refused to sell. So the conclusion was inevitable. If the right jacket didn't exist, he would have to make it. So in 2007, Satoshi moved his operation to Tokyo. And from his vintage business, he pivoted to the making business. The shift from collector to maker is a significant one, but unlike his contemporaries, Satoshi was not interested in reproductions as we understand them. What he describes as new vintage sits in a different category entirely. Garments with the atmosphere of the original and designed to become vintage over years of use. And unlike reproductions that honor the past through faithful reenactment, New Vintage tells you exactly what that tradition is and demands you build something worthy of it going forward. So Satoshi isn't just selling a jacket. He's recruiting people willing to put in the years, the wear, the accumulated use that transforms a new piece into the kind of object that will be sought after decades from now. But Ishijima-san didn't desire to gatekeep this for the right people. He explains that while the image of the writer is at the heart of the culture he pulls from, he explicitly views the product he develops as something anyone could enjoy. This idea, however, required solving a material problem first. Leather isn't as simple as many of us assume. You got different animals, different grades, different tanning processes and finishing treatments, each one producing a material that behaves completely differently under stress, over time, and against the body. In the case of leather jackets, it goes one step deeper: cultural proclivity. The tradition splits into two distinct schools in most cases. We have the American cruiser tradition. It ran on steer hide and horse hide. It was dense, protective, built for mass and durability. And then the British racer tradition ran on sheepskin, lighter, more agile, with a grain and drape that the heavier hides couldn't replicate. A British sheepskin was prized for its ability to be thick and insulating, yet remarkably lightweight, allowing for greater mobility on the bike. The silhouette that came from it was slim, streamlined, built for speed rather than intimidation. But by the time Satoshi was deep in his archive work, sheepskin's reputation had softened into something closer to a liability. It was good looking for sure, but fragile. Why? Because most standard fashion sheepskin today sits at around 0.8 millimeters. Pliable, but without the density to crease meaningfully.
ほとんどの場合、素材から入るんですよ。レザージャケットの場合はほとんどはホースハイドかカウハイドが多いけど、シープスキンがメインマテリアルっていうのはまず珍しいし、意識的にじゃなくて結果素材にフューチャーして素材から商品を広げていくことの方が多分多いと思います。多分素材が好きなんだと思う。
What Satoshi wanted was the fluidity of sheepskin with the weight and protective presence of the 1950s originals. So he spent years working with local Japanese tanneries to develop a proprietary hide measuring between 1.5 millimeters and 1.7 millimeters, nearly double the industry standard. That difference is what eventually becomes the face of an addict jacket. And the tanning process deepens this further. Satoshi uses what's called T-core. The hide is dyed brown first, then over-dyed black. And as the top coat wears away at the seams, elbows, and cuffs over years of use, the brown base layer surfaces, creating a high contrast visual record of the owner's movements. And the same logic extends to the hardware. The original British jackets of the 1950s used cotton tape, cotton that fades, frays, and shifts color with use. Those zippers don't exist today as a ready-made product, so Addict manufactures them from scratch. Custom pulls modeled on rare 1950s designs, square in boxes, some with zipper tapes in slightly different tones to simulate uneven sun exposure over decades. And that is the material argument at the center of Addict Clothes. But after settling on the method, New Vintage needed a home. And the shop nestled in the heart of Shinjuku sets a standard that puts Addict Clothes in rarefied air. In 2010, the Addict Clothes Shinjuku flag shop opened, and it is not a conventional retail space. Walk in, and the first thing you register is the motorcycles. Restored British bikes from the 1950s and 60s, lined along the walls, filed on the floor, presented in the main window, Triumphs, OK Supremes, machines that are scarcely seen anywhere these days. These beautifully restored pieces aren't just for show. they are 100% operational. Satoshi, alongside a dedicated professional mechanic who previously ran his own shop, is responsible for keeping them running in a workshop that is quite literally inside the store itself. Close enough to the stock to share the same air, far enough to keep releases clean and ready for purchase. But the message is unmistakable. Addict Clothes is not just about the jackets. It's not even just about the culture. It's about everything embedded in the word the brand takes its name after. Satoshi even wears Addict clothing while working on those bikes. The jackets get sprayed with oil, exposed to engine heat, subjected to the specific mechanical stress of a working garage. And even that is intentional. Understanding the physical demands of riding a vintage machine, the ergonomics, the heat, the friction, directly informs how the sleeves in a jacket are curved, where back pleats are placed, how each garment functions when it's actually being used. The effect on the customer is hard to manufacture, and the jacket on the rack carries a context that no amount of brand storytelling can substitute for. It's one of those places that makes you fall in love with the pieces even if you had never been interested in leather jackets before. And in many ways, it's more of an inspiration than a transactional experience. In a global fashion economy built on seasonal pressure, Addict Clothes runs on a completely different logic. The AD-01, the first jacket Satoshi ever made, known internally as zero-ichi, has remained virtually unchanged for 15 years. It is still the best-selling piece in the lineup.
新しいものが必要というよりも、僕がどう理解をして、どうその商品にちゃんとこう形にしてどうお客さんに伝わるかの方が大事だから、ちょっとそれとのプロセスはちょっとだいぶ違うし、デザインプロセスなんてもういくらでもあるし、もう多分追いつかないと思う。困ることはないで、どんどん増えてるっていうやりたいこともかなり、スローだと思う。いろんな商品が出てるんだけど実際はあんまり出てないんですよ。
To manage creative range without diluting the core of what his brand is, Satoshi built a structure. The Addict Clothes Japan label stays strictly within the British biker lineage, in a kind of archival stasis. Everything else, American workwear, military textiles, knitwear, French industrial inspiration, there's the ACVM line. This is where the broader wardrobe expands. It's a system designed to scale without compromising the thing that made it worth scaling in the first place. And this is a reoccurring pattern. Japan doesn't simply import foreign traditions, it studies them. By all accounts, Ishijima-san is only doing what his culture has done time and time again. And what that looks like in practice in the Shinjuku store with the bikes and the archive is not simply a brand, it's a philosophy with a floor plan. The jacket is almost beside the point. Satoshi is proving that you don't have to make something worth owning by making it look important. You can make it worth owning by engineering it to earn its character over time. Most people who love clothes are chasing something, a look, a feeling, a version of themselves that feels more complete when the right piece is on their back. Satoshi Ishijima is chasing something entirely different. He's chasing the truth of an object. And it took 50 years of Japanese garment literacy, one man's particular obsession, and a Tensubo shop in Toyama to make it possible. With all that being said, we want to close out by saying thank you genuinely to Satoshi Ishijima and the entire Addict Clothes team for allowing us into the Shinjuku store and sharing the work so openly. Access like this doesn't happen often, and it meant everything to us to be trusted with it. Now, if this episode sent you in the direction of the shop or the archive, that's exactly what it was supposed to do. But stories like this one don't come easy. Getting inside a shop like Addict Clothes takes months of relationship building and a reason to be trusted. And your support through YouTube memberships is what makes that possible and what gets us in the door for the next one. So if you can, it would be greatly appreciated if you became a member today. But at the very least, subscribe, like, and let us know in the comments what you think about Addict Clothes. And as always, keep it casual. Yoroshiku onegai shimasu. I'll see you all in a minute.